So, for today, the lecture is entitled Gathering the Data. So, this is what happens after we frame the problem and come up with a design on how we intend to analyze the data, okay, the facts that we are going to collect in order for us to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So now all that's left is actually gathering that data. Now, for this particular lecture, uh, we are going to look at three tools. Now, there are many tools out there, right? There are many tools that we will be using in the course of our consulting work. Okay, and true enough, data gathering is actually a very important consulting skill. The fact that we want to be fact driven, okay, gathering data, making sure that we have this empirical mindset is something that is really expected of every consultant, especially nowadays. And the reason why we want to collect data, okay, a lot of it, is that because much of our daily decision making in business lacks some sort of a rigorous fact based support. Okay, we see that nowadays. Um, in fact, it is not uncommon that certain people would be driven by gut feel. Okay, but if you ask them for justification for decisions based on gut feel, they are struggling to actually come up with the right support or the right answers. But as consultants, we cannot just completely rely on gut feel. Now, gut feel, okay, to be fair, we've talked about this when we were framing the problem and coming up with the hypothesis. It can help, it can be a good start even, but as we go through the structure, going through all of these things eventually, it's not enough that we just rely on gut feel. We have to support it with actual data. And for this particular lecture, okay, we're going to focus on three tools, three techniques, three ideas. Okay. Well, first is coming up with a good toolbox for research strategies. Now, in that toolbox, there could be a lot of things, but definitely you need to have a strategy on how you want to collect your data. That's number one. Number two, the most important tool, I would say, in data gathering for consultants is the interview. Okay, everybody who is doing consulting work should have an idea on how to go about with interviews. Okay, and the last tool, the third tool that we'll talk about, okay, is in relation to knowledge management. So you can take a look at this lecture, very long lecture, into three parts. We look at research strategies, okay, and then we look at the interview technique itself, and then we go with knowledge management, okay. And you can see that these three parts are actually connected, okay, they're interrelated. I will see what happens in that in that respect. Okay, first, when we look at coming up with a good research strategy, a good framework for research strategy, even, well, here are some of the principles that you might like to keep in mind. Okay, number one, facts are friendly. Okay, the second principle is don't accept I have no idea, I don't know. Uh, Maybe in casual conversation with friends, that's probably okay. But when you're doing consulting work, you cannot settle with an answer, I have no idea. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a while. And the third principle here is that there are some research tips that have been built over time by consultants in the past. So I think it's also good for us to review what these tips are. And by reviewing these tips, we actually avoid pitfalls. Okay, with respect to our research efforts. Okay, facts are friendly. Facts on their own, they're harmless. They don't really tell you more than what they are, right? And they're friendly in the sense that, well, one, they compensate for a consultant's lack of experience and intuition relative to somebody who is more experienced. For example, an executive, okay, with years and years of business experience. Okay, especially for you, if you're just starting to do consulting or you haven't had an idea on what consulting is and you'd be interested to do more of it, well, you don't have the experience. That's a fact. But you can make use of facts that are available, okay, with the client, with the circumstances of the client, to actually help build your position later on. Okay. Now, facts also bridge the credibility gap, okay, between the consultant and the client. We talked earlier about the difference between competency and credibility. We know that competency is something that's internal. Okay, this is something that the consultant actually is able to demonstrate. Okay, the accomplishments that the consultant does, that's part of his or her competency. Credibility is external. This is what others think of you as a consultant. And if you put in facts, I mean, even if you're not that credible yet because you're new to the business, you haven't done consulting work in the past, by coming up with facts to help support your position, this actually helps you build your case. Okay, and they allow the consultant to show she knows her stuff or he knows her stuff. Okay, and despite the power of facts, or possibly because of the power of facts, many business people fear them. Okay, your clients in particular may fear them. It's like you want to avoid knowing the truth about, let's say, if you're sick with a terminal disease, for example, you probably won't want to have yourself checked right away, especially if you're experiencing a few symptoms left and right, and then you know that perhaps the next best step is to actually have yourself checked. Well, some people don't have themselves checked because of fear of what they'll probably discover. I mean, that's possible. But hiding from unpleasant facts will only delay the inevitable. And one advice here, life advice, as I would say, would be, you'd probably don't want to keep on hiding things for long, with the purpose of avoiding knowing what they are. I mean, it's better to know now so that you know what you can do about it. Okay, that's the same thing also with consulting, and that's the reason why you're also there. You're supposed to help them know these things as soon as possible so that they have more time to respond to the facts that you will uncover. Now, the second principle here is, don't accept I have no idea. Don't accept that, okay, with a sub question or a sub issue that you want to resolve, the thing that you've come up with is, well, I don't know, I have no idea. Well, in the course of your data gathering, you'll have to ask few pointed questions. And sometimes it's in the manner how we ask the questions, or sometimes it's in the manner or maybe the idea of what data we want to collect. Sometimes we don't even know what we want to collect, but if we do know what we want to collect, then we will actually get an answer somehow, right? So really, your challenge is to figure out the source of resistance and adjust accordingly. If by asking people you get some sort of a clueless type of response, right? Remember too that just as you shouldn't accept the answer "I have no idea" from others, you shouldn't accept it from yourself. So if you come up with some sort of a dead end, you don't know what's going to happen next, you pretty much, like, you have no idea. Well, you can't accept that for yourself as well. I mean, you have to push yourself to make sure that you find some sort of an answer. Any answer would do, right? I mean, and that's fine. And the objective right now is, you do not want to have an answer. Okay, the objective is you want to have an answer. Okay, even if the answer doesn't seem to be solid enough, or if the answer can still be questionable. I mean, that's fine. I mean, that can happen. Okay, but of course, you, for yourself, you shouldn't accept the idea that you have no idea. Okay, and we'll look with some research tips. These are just some, But well, first of all, you may want to start with the annual report of your client. The annual report is a sample of a published document that is available for everyone's consumption. The annual report typically offers a wealth of information about the company in just a single document. Okay. Be sure to read the messages the shareholders, the CEO reports. But as a consultant, you're not just going to gloss over the annual report. And definitely, you're not just going to stick with the annual report and not read other documents, okay, that are publicly available. You also take a look at press releases, news, disclosures by the company throughout the year. You don't just stick with the annual report. But if you're starting in your consulting business and this is the first time that you're dealing with a client, it helps to have some sort of an annual report to help ground your idea on what or who your client is. Okay? And then look for outliers. Look for situations that may not exactly be usual or may not be normal, perhaps. Okay? And that's what happens with outlier analysis. Now, outlier analysis is a tool to isolate key opportunities for investigation within a firm. So you look at anomalies of some sort. These are outliers. Anomalies tend to have a negative connotation, like there's some sort of scandalous events that's happening there. Well, it doesn't have to be that. It could be, but it doesn't have to be that. But what outlier analysis really means is that you are looking for something that's not usual. Okay, not usual for the company and not even usual for other companies in the same industry, for example. You look for that. Okay. And what do you do with it? Well, you don't do anything with it yet. You just look for outliers, right? It's a combination of your outliers and the other things that you collect along the way that will probably give you some insight. But more than that, you don't just do anything with the outliers yet. Okay. Okay, there are a lot of ways of looking for outliers. Okay, could be comparing ratios, calculating key measures, paying particular to high performers, to low performers, paying attention to a bad year, paying attention to a good quarter or a good half or a good month or a good week. Okay, so normally these are things that you look out for. Okay, and also looking for best practices within the organization. Okay, most companies can still learn from a competitor or other top performing organization, even ones that are outside of the industry. Okay. When you look for best practices, I mean that's remember, this is just starting things out, right? This is not the complete analysis, the complete research that you're doing, right? But sometimes, and this is what the literature also talks about, looking for weak links, looking for something that is probably not related to your company, but that's going to be helpful, that's going to be impactful sometime in the future. So that is what you're trying to look for as regards best practices. So it could be something that maybe one or two companies are doing, but they actually produce great results. So maybe these are things that you look out for. Okay. So aside from looking for outliers, you also look for best practices. Okay. And a combination of that, you also look for outlier best practices. That's also a possibility. Now, once you have the starting point for research, for data gathering, you'd really want to have what is known as a strategic data gathering approach, right? You don't just simply gather data like thinking like it's like a vacuum cleaner in hand, right? You just wave the vacuum cleaner left and right, and just draw up whatever data that you have. Of course, there's the saying, garbage in, garbage out. So if you're very indiscriminate with your data gathering, then you might pick up some data that's really useless. That's not going to be useful. So you just ended up wasting time. Okay? So having some sort of a strategic data gathering helps you be more effective, makes you more efficient in really understanding your data requirements, right? So the first idea in strategic data gathering is diagnosing the data orientation of your organization, and this refers to your client. Okay, you'd want to understand, well, are these guys data driven? Are they data oriented, or are they, like off the cuff, playing things by gut feel, very instinctive or intuitive? Okay, so you take a look. Okay, at the data orientation of the organization. Okay, and then you demonstrate the power of good facts. You show them that it's nice to be always fact driven, that you always base your decisions on facts. Okay? And then lastly, is building the proper infrastructure, which would be helpful in the third part of this lecture concerning knowledge management. Now, the first idea, diagnosing the data orientation of your organization. Okay, the cultures of organizations vary widely as to their data orientations, how they view data, right? That's one way for us to look at what data orientation means. Okay. Now, the absence of facts is a potential inhibitor for effective decision making. I mean, you would probably experience it yourself. If you are not the type to gather data, then it would be very difficult for you to make decisions when it would be perfectly normal to gather data. Okay? And the first step in advancing data collection efforts in your organization is to assess your situation honestly. Are you a data-driven organization? Okay, there are a lot of articles and books that talk about this. And in any case, this is a very important first step. Okay, I mean, if you are unable to admit to yourself that you are not data-driven, then no matter how hard you try to be data-driven in your consulting work, it will not go as how you'd plan it to be or as how you desire it to be. Now, once you've analyzed your organization, you can begin redressing any imbalances you discover, particularly the aspects you can control. Now, next idea in strategic data gathering is demonstrating the power of good facts. By devoting more thought and attention to data gathering, you will be able to generate credible insights you might not otherwise reach. And with a fact base, your insights will be credible. Okay? So, sometimes people shy away from being fact driven, primarily because of the effort that's required to gather facts. Okay, think about it. If you are expected to gather, forage a lot of data, that's time consuming. There's a lot of effort required for that. Okay, that's a given. That's understandable. Nobody blames you for that. Okay, but it's required. Required in the sense that if you really want to perform well as a consultant, then you have to put in the effort. You have to put in the hard work to collect data. And if you think about it, that's just the start. We haven't really talked about the other things that you'll need to do as a consultant. Okay? And by relying more on facts, you should be able to increase the impact of your analysis and recommendations within your organization. So I think this is also one way on how we can help improve our mode of argumentation, right? Sometimes we debate with people, but we instinctively rely too much on opinion. Opinion that's perhaps just a personal preference, but it's not really based on facts. Okay. Of course, just to let you know also, the other side of the story is that it's not all facts, right? You don't just simply gather facts and hope that the stories will come out as they are, okay, without having you putting in the effort to interpret the facts, which is another topic later on. Okay, but nevertheless, I mean, if all we do is being judgmental, jumping to conclusions, as they say, without collecting the necessary facts, then we'll find ourselves at a difficult situation. We'll find ourselves at an impasse, if you may. And the third idea is, building the proper infrastructure. Okay, so studies, names of experts, okay, sanitized reports. Sanitized meaning you censor out confidential information, but would still contain information that's still useful. Industry studies, analyst reports. Okay, this is based on the U.S., Wall Street. In the Philippines, we take a look at our analyst reports also for our local stock market. These things we collect. Okay, and these are typically the first things that we should have when we're starting consulting work. But it's not just about collecting information as it is, right? It's about knowing the right information as well. Okay, but for sure, because there's effort involved, okay, so expect that you will burn time, expect that you'll also burn money, but you probably need to spend a lot, okay, for sure, if you really want to have a strategic data gathering infrastructure for yourself. Okay, it need not be a technical infrastructure like some sort of a system or having something based on the cloud, perhaps. Infrastructure can also mean your team, your organization. You probably have people, staff who do these things for you. That is also part of your proper infrastructure. Now, setting this infrastructure in place, it is important to identify, above all, your key data sources for the kind of information most important to your particular organization. It's one thing to have your team in place, all the systems running, but if you don't know where to source your information, uh, it, all these things that you already have, the resources that are at your disposal, they're nothing. They're not going to get you far. Okay? And of course, spending whatever is necessary to secure those sources. Okay? Sometimes we need to pay to get databases, copies of databases, or copies of documents such as company disclosures, annual reports. Some of them are online. I mean, some of them are available for free. You can download them. That's not going to be an issue, right? But definitely you will expect to spend a significant amount if you really want to have the right infrastructure in place. But definitely it's not some sort of unlimited spending. Right? It will be based on whatever you can possibly can afford, right? You don't have unlimited budget. Well, if you're lucky to be in an organization that has a lot of money, then okay. I mean, that's probably good for you. But more than anything else, it's a common understanding that there will be limits to what you can actually spend. Okay. Now, as we go through these tips, as we go through these ideas regarding strategic data gathering, how do we go about with it? How do we start implementing these things? Now, as you consider the potential impact of facts, okay, powerful facts even, in your organization, you try out strategic data gathering and seek to provide insights not previously available. Okay? So that's really the goal of effective data gathering. If you're able to collect data that perhaps in the past you would have not normally gathered. Okay? If you're able to gather the important things now, that's good for you. Okay? That's something that you should be happy and proud of, okay, as you move forward in your consulting engagement. Now, based on your company's primary objectives, okay, such as profitability, growth of sales, revenue, take the time to find out what is important. Okay? Then gather the right facts and then share your insights afterwards. When it comes to building a more fact-based culture, don't try to go at it alone. Okay? Seek the help of your team, seek the help of your advocates within your organization. Maybe you also have some people what they call as mentors or even sponsors. Work with them so that you can have a more fact-based culture. And then make the investment to hire research specialists. Or in some cases, we call them research assistants, right? And grant full authority to purchase the right journals and reports that will prove useful to decision making in the organization. Now, you have to be selective as well. You don't, as I said earlier, you don't have like unlimited budget, so you can't really spend for everything that comes your way. So you select. Okay, you monitor also your spending. If you're noticing that you're spending too much, but the data that you get in return isn't really that commensurate, then you probably would want to scale back with your approach. Okay, you probably would want to look at a different source, or you probably want to focus more on certain areas. Maybe pivot some of your team members to look at other domains, okay, other sources as well. But remember, you need more than just a budget, right? You also need the right cultural elements, including the incentives to increase the usage of facts in your organization. So it's not just, buying subscription left and right, and then that's it. We leave it at that. No, I mean, make sure that there's that supporting culture that would enable you to capitalize and maximize whatever you've spent as far as data gathering is concerned, right? Like subscriptions. I mean, if nobody's really maximizing it, it doesn't make sense for you to go through those subscriptions. So here are some of the selected public data sources. This might be a little bit dated, but you're not limited to just these, right? There are many possible sources, especially in the Philippine context. Uh, you might even ask, is social media a very good source of information? It could be. But what's difficult with social media is that they are sometimes not verified, or that phenomenon of fake news, right? So you're not exactly sure how credible the information would be, but nevertheless it's also a good starting point. But you don't pin your hopes just in social media. You also want to do what we've said earlier, the idea of triangulating, right? Verifying, double checking whatever information that we've actually received or gathered. Now we go to the second tool, okay, which is the interview. Uh, Interviews are structured. They have to be structured, but more than the science, okay, of interviewing, it's really an art. It's something that for you to master this tool, you have to do it, number one, and you have to keep on doing it. So the moment that you say, well, I don't want to do interviews, well, you can't really avoid that. At some point in time, you have to do interviews. The mere fact that you're asking someone a question, that is like an interview, right? Because an interview is nothing more than really getting the perspective of somebody else based on something that you have, right? Like a question. So that's the idea of the interview. So here are some of the tips. Okay, we'll go into more detail for each one regarding interviews. But number one, and this is a very good advice, is being prepared. Having an interview guide. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a while. And when you're conducting interviews, the idea is you want to get information from the other person. So what you should be doing in every interview is you listen. But just like that saying earlier, garbage in, garbage out, you don't just simply be passive, right? This is where active listening comes into the picture. So when you listen, you also guide. Okay, so the idea of giving follow-up questions, okay, or trying to validate or even paraphrasing what the interviewee may have said, okay, that's part of listening, okay. But on the opposite end, okay, of being passive, you shouldn't be too aggressive with the interview. It's like it's always you doing the talking and not the interviewee. It should be the other way around. The one who should be talking a lot should be the interviewee and not you as the interviewer. Okay, we'll talk about some tips on successful interviews. Don't leave the interviewee naked. I mean, that's another tip. You're extracting information from the interviewee, so make it worth her while. Make it worth his while. I mean, don't really put your interviewee in a compromising situation. Your interviewee would have exerted a lot of effort to help you. Okay, so more than just compensating the interviewee, you make sure that you make the experience of the interviewee something positive. Okay. Then we'll talk a little bit about difficult interviews. Now that's pretty complex, okay, but we'll get to see that in a little while. Okay, what we mean by difficult interviews. And lastly, this is a very good tip. Always write a thank you note. Okay, and I would say that also true for the interviewee, right? Don't forget to thank also your interviewer, because your interviewer values you. The fact that you've been interviewed, okay, it means that the interviewer knows and recognizes that you have something of value to them. So it's important that you also thank them. Okay. for that opportunity. But nevertheless, I mean, as an interviewer yourself, you should also thank your interviewee, because without the interviewee, you wouldn't be able to get the information that you're looking for. Okay. Now, be prepared writing an interview guide. Okay, an interview guide is simply a written list of questions. Okay, it's arranged also in a particular order you expect to ask of them. So typically, you'd want to start with an easy question, and then you ease in your way through the more difficult ones. Okay, but it's something structured. You have prepared questions, but your interview, okay, is something that is not too rigid. Later on, you'll find out that you have to have certain level of flexibility with your interview guide. When I do interviews, I probably just have one page. In fact, as much as possible, I don't want to have anything more than one page. But I know that I should be able to carry the interview such that I'm not limited to one page. Okay? And this is where active listening comes into the picture, because by then you'll be able to really pick up certain things, and that would allow you to do follow-up questions, okay? Even if they're not prepared or written down in your guide. Now, there are two reasons why you should have a guide. Well, placing your thoughts on paper forces you to organize them. You don't just come into an interview, with no guide, and hoping that divine intervention, divine inspiration will make you ask the right questions. It doesn't happen that way. Maybe, if you're lucky enough, you might be able to ask the questions off the cuff, but it's not always the case. That's not going to be the thing that's going to be consistent. Okay? It's good to have things organized, and having an interview guide ensures that level of organization. Now, the second reason is the guide helps the interviewee identify the topics you intend to cover in the interview, and also help them prepare. So really, the interview guide is also not a surprise. You're supposed to actually inform your interviewee the questions that you intend to ask. That's just good etiquette. Okay, you don't just go to the interview, and keep your questions hidden from the interviewee. Proper etiquette would dictate that everything that you expect to ask, you inform them beforehand. Naturally, you also have to inform the interviewee that you may ask questions, clarificatory in nature or follow-up questions, based on his or her answer to your main questions. So in your interview guide, this will just be your main questions, but that doesn't restrict you from asking follow-up questions or clarificatory questions, right? Your guide should be brief, okay? So boil down. In this case, the tip is just to limit it to 3 or 4. All right, no problem. I mean, my tip would be just one page. Anything that would fit in one page, that's it. No more than that. Okay. But obviously, if your guide is written in very small font, it's a useless guide, right? You'll have difficulty reading through the text. So obviously, you can probably cheat your way around it with the one-page tip. Say, yeah, I'm just gonna make the font very small. But if you can't read your guide, it's a useless guide, right? So, and your goal should be to get those answered in the limited time that you have with the interviewee. Anything more is, as they say, gravy. It's a bonus. One more thing that perhaps the literature doesn't really establish it formally, right? Is that when you do the interview, it's not just about data gathering. Of course, in the context of this lecture, the idea is that you do the interview because you want to collect data. But the interview also has a secondary purpose, a secondary function, if you may. And that's to build the rapport with the interviewee, especially if your interviewee is a key sponsor or a key user or a key stakeholder on the client side. Okay. So the interview is just like any normal chat perhaps, but it's still good that you have something prepared. Okay, it's still formally an interview. Nevertheless, the interview should not just be limited for data gathering. It is also an opportunity for you as a consultant to build a relationship with the interviewee. Okay, and in a way, and this is where the emotional side of consulting comes into the picture. You help them appreciate your value, your role at that moment, right? You're not there like some robot. You have a guide in hand, just one page, blurting out one question at a time, recording whatever it is that they answer, and that's it. Okay. The interview does have a certain level of relationship building value, that it's good for you guys to appreciate that now, more than just going through the interview in a very mechanical process as of how we've laid it down here. Now, when conducting your interviews, listen and guide. Okay. Listen, okay, and by listening, it also means that you learn to be sensitive as well. You know whether the sometimes you don't know it beforehand, but there could be questions that might be offending to them. Okay, so you have to know when to pedal back. Okay, but if you are having some difficulty also extracting information, even if it's prepared, no, sometimes we think that if we prepare the question, it's like the ultimate question. Nobody's going to refuse to answer the question, something to that effect. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's possible that your prepared questions will not elicit a very generous response from the interviewee. And this is what we call active listening, acknowledging the interviewee, okay, with nods, interjections, the ahas. But I wouldn't recommend that you keep on doing it for the sake of just filling the silence, right? I mean, when you nod, when you try to acknowledge, say aha, aha, there has to be genuine understanding. There has to be genuine recognition of what the interview is saying, right? And not just simply blurting out aha, or not just simply nodding your head, no, as if you're play acting. Okay, no, I mean, you really need to understand what the other person is saying, and these are just manifestations of you telling the interviewee that you are actually listening, that you are responding positively to what the interview is saying. Okay, but also, when you are actively listening, you don't try to fill in the dead air. Sometimes it's important to force silence. Why? And you will notice this. If you don't try to fill in the dead air quickly, you are actually forcing the hand of the interviewee to speak up, right? Now, not unless the interviewee is really not in the mood to disclose anything, maybe for legitimate reasons. More often than not, the interviewee will eventually fill in the silence. Okay, so don't try to fill in the silence yourself. Let the interviewee talk. Okay, and speak about it. Okay. Now, also use positive language. Okay, so this is one area wherein you want to make sure that you exercise non-verbal cues. Okay, if your body language is communicating to the interviewee that you're bored, that you're irritated, that you want to get this along, you get a response from the interviewee that they'll probably not cooperate with you. So that's also a negative effect. So make sure that you're there. You really show to the interviewee that you're interested in the interviewee, and you're not just going through the motions. It's also a sign of respect also to the interviewee. Remember, you are pulling them off from whatever it is that they're doing. They could be doing something else, but they're there with you. You're conducting an interview with them. So that's the idea with with having positive body language. Okay, and don't let the interviewee lead you off on tangents or the garden path, as they say. I mean, make sure that your interviewee really answers your question. Don't let the interviewee veer off course, right? Don't let the interviewee avoid the issue, right? But there's an elegant or a diplomatic way to do that with the interviewee. Sometimes the interviewee doesn't know that he or she is veering off course, but there are some interviewees who are actively trying to derail the interview, right? They're gonna give you false leads. They'll probably say something else that's probably not important. Okay, but you have to be on the watch out. You have to make sure that you are able to pull them back on track. Okay, and you can do that if you are listening very well with your interviewee. Now, here are some tips for successful interviews. There are 7. This is what the textbook say. You don't really have to follow them to the letter literally. Okay. The others are 7, but let's go to them one by one. So The idea here is that okay, well, have the interviewee's boss set up the meeting. Okay. Uh, the reason why you want the interviewee's boss to set up the meeting is that in a way it forces the handler of the interviewee to meet you, right? So if your boss tells you that okay, you have an interview, well, you have no choice. You have to go ahead and then accommodate your boss, right? So sometimes you just talk to somebody above that person and then let that person take care of managing or scheduling that interview with you for you. You interview in pairs. Well, when we interview with pairs, we look at making sure that we don't want to be efficient, right? You want to make sure that you don't want to just interview one at a time. It's time consuming. If you can actually bundle people together, okay, okay. Even you as interviewers also, if you have more than one interviewers who would probably need to ask something to the interviewees themselves, then it's also good to have some sort of a panel type of interview. I mean, that's fine. Listen, don't lead. Don't try to monopolize the conversation. Okay. Paraphrase. If you don't know if you can't really understand what the person is saying, well, try to interpret it according to what you think it is. Then you get validation from the interview if the interpretation is correct. Using an indirect approach. Sometimes you can gather data without being too direct, especially if the question is quite sensitive in nature. So probably they're ashamed or they're scared to answer things directly. So maybe without forcing them to answer the question directly, you can ask questions that would actually let you get that same information eventually, right? And use a little bit of triangulation. Don't ask for too much. I mean, just stick with what you have, okay? I mean, with a time limit, with your interview guide, don't try to veer away from it, okay? And adopt the Colombo tactic. Now, the Colombo tactic is this. So it's an old television show wherein, okay, you often finish the question, okay, but then just when the person thinks that you're done, then you come up with one more question that's usually like the most explosive question you can think of. This tactic is good because the suspects, in the case of the TV show, the suspects feel that their guard is already down. They think, okay, the interview's done. I can get away already. Then all of a sudden, boom, you caught them off guard. They're forced to answer a question that they didn't expect that would be asked of them. But you can try this approach if you think the interviewee is actively holding out on you, that they're not really helpful or cooperative in sharing information with you. Okay, so another tip here is not leaving the interviewee naked. Okay, not literally, definitely, but the idea that you have to make sure that the interviewee's experience of the interview is a positive experience. Okay, some people they don't like to be interviewed. That happens. Okay, there are some that are okay to be interviewed. Okay, you're lucky if you have these types of interviewees, but some don't like to be interviewed. As the interviewer, you are responsible for being sensitive to the fears of the interviewees. Okay, so establish that connection, that rapport with him or her in order to get those bits of information that you seek. Don't force the situation, right? If the interviewee is so nervous or anxious, don't force the interviewee to give you as much data as you'd hope for. Sometimes it might be just good enough to get a few and adjourn the conversation. Okay, that's it. Okay. Also, once you've gotten the information that you need, don't squeeze the interviewee dry and leave him regretting the process afterwards. Okay. Again, it's all about making the positive experience. And just what we said a while ago, the reason why we want to do the interview is not just to collect data, but to really build that relationship and that rapport with your client, okay, which would be useful in the future, especially if you want to get some favors from them in order to help facilitate or speed things up. Okay. Instead, take the time to explain the positive impact the information may make. Okay. Especially if you think that them answering your question might be like them squealing out on their teammates, or feeling like a traitor to their organization. They shouldn't feel that way, right? And whenever they give you good information, you should also give something in return. Okay, well, not just the thank you note, which we'll talk a bit later, but really something else. Okay, something more than just a thank you, right? And remember, as an interviewer, and this is what most interviewers forget, or most consultants forget, is that they actually occupy a position of power. Really, when you're in an interview, there's nothing an interviewee can do, right? You're just, as an interviewee, you're just stuck there. I mean, you can really force your way and say, I don't want to be interviewed. You can do that. But then, at the end of the day, it will just leave everybody feeling a bad aftertaste, right? But okay, but regardless, I mean, assuming that you're a nice guy, that you're a very polite guy, you wouldn't want to just force the interview, or the interviewer rather, force the interviewer to play by your tune, right? It's really the interviewer's authority in a way to dictate the tempo, the pace of the interview process itself, because the interviewer has an objective, and that objective is data gathering. So, depends, and you wouldn't know what data is really being asked. Maybe some clear idea, but it's the interviewer's prerogative to determine for himself or herself whether the data that I'm supposed to gather has actually been gathered. Now, talking a little bit about difficult interviews, this will happen. You will encounter situations wherein it can be very difficult. Okay, that people are, they can be bad interviewees. There are people like that. Or maybe the situation is difficult. Maybe you're in a place that's not conducive for interviews. Maybe you're in an environment that there's threat all around you. Maybe the timing is not right. Okay, I mean, these all contribute to difficult interviews. No matter how well prepared or sensitive you are, you will eventually face someone who is just a difficult interviewee. Okay, if the interview is playing hardball, you may have to as well. Okay, and this person could be a sandbagger, an individual who purposely withholds key information. Unfortunately, in as much as we'd like to be benevolent, okay, or we'd like to think well of others, particularly interviewees, the reality of the situation is that some interviewees, not all, some interviewees can really withhold information deliberately. And what you do is you try to navigate through that. I mean, you try to find out the path of least resistance, okay? But really, if you think that the interviewee will not get you the information that you need, don't waste a single moment. Adjourn the interview, move on to something else, and maybe whatever information that you've been hoping to get from that person, hopefully you can get that from others, right? Or maybe if you're not able to fully get that from others, maybe what's really missing in your knowledge of whatever it is that you really want to gather, right? You can triangulate that, or you can make good inferences, which is just as good, or maybe make good analogies. Okay, looking for logical equivalences. You can do that. These are other techniques that you can do to fill in the gaps that are not supplied by the interview directly. Okay. And the most difficult interviewee is the person whose job is truly threatened by the problem-solving process, by your consulting work. Okay. For example, if the client asks you to investigate or study the possibility of automation, so that would mean that certain roles would have to be removed. People in those roles will feel threatened by you asking them, okay, do you think your work can be automated by some machine or some bot? I don't think they'll be well. I mean, if they're like very old people, for example, they want to retire, maybe they want to rest, they feel forced to do the work, maybe they will accommodate you, but that's not always the case. Okay. You will encounter interviewees who will push back, who will resist. Okay. But sometimes there's no other solution. You just have to push forward. You just have to keep on making progress, even if the progress that you get is not that much, right? And sometimes you just have to force it. You just have to keep on moving forward. Just go through the process, as they say. Maybe you hope for the best, but you do your part. You do your part. Do everything that you need to do. Do the preparation. Do the interviewing. Do the active listening. Do everything. Okay. And if the interview is really difficult, that's not your fault. And lastly, always write a thank you note. Okay, being grateful. I think that's the whole message here. It's not just good etiquette, it's good business. Okay. Thank you letters can really help in building a relationship that can yield future benefits. As I said earlier, it's not just about at the end where you give thank you letters that would help build the relationship. It's throughout the interview process. That is a relationship building exercise. You know. And sometimes we are engaged in conversations with people that, if you think about it, those are actually form of interviews. Okay, remember, an interview is one way for us to gather data, gather facts, okay, through normal conversation between people. Okay, so it need not have this formal structure. Definitely, when we go through interviews, there has to be some sort of structure. There has to be a guide, okay? It has to be disclosed formally that it is an interview and not just some chit chat like we normally do. Okay, but yeah, interview is all around us, you know, and interviews, okay, in its most abstract sense, is actually not just data gathering but relationship building. Okay, many of us need to fight the temptation to neglect this courtesy. Okay, sometimes we can say to ourselves, I don't have time, besides I'll be interviewing so many people, maybe I'll just give them one massive thank you note at the end. Oh no, I mean, good etiquette will tell you after each and every interview, you thank them. You send them something. Maybe give them a token. Okay, if your budget can allow you. But definitely, I mean, you should budget for these things, for tokens as well. And then this is where you take time to smell the roses. Thank them for the help that they've supplied for you. Now, how to make the most out of the interviewing? Okay, well, we've talked about this already, so it's really just emphasizing the important bolts, really, right? Number one, structuring your interviews. Have something prepared. You don't come into an interview that is spontaneous, right? So structure them. That's the first. That's one way for you to maximize your interviewing process. Second, it's about listening. It's not about you talking, because your interview, okay, who's really doing the talking? It's really the interviewee and not you as the interviewer. You're just the guide. You're just like the conductor at the orchestra. You're not the one playing the tune, but you would want that person to play the tune that is appropriate for the setting. It's appropriate for the piece. Okay? So if you're supposed to play like a Mozart, you don't let your interviewee orchestra play Beethoven. That's really wrong, right? And that's your responsibility as the conductor in that way. So it's about listening. At the same time, it's also being sensitive, being respectful of the fact that the other person is also just like you. Okay? Full of emotions, okay? Could be easily triggered, okay? Has other concerns besides the interview itself, okay? So that's also being sensitive. Like, that's why it's important that you're also grateful for the interviewee, that you make their experience comfortable, okay, very positive. You need to highlight that the interview is supposed to be for them, that there's also going to be something positive for them. So let's take a look at how this really works, okay? Structuring the interviews. Even in less formal situations, we do recommend sticking to a structure. The interview guides is one evidence that I can say that is important. Okay, if I want to find out if an interview is structured or not, if I see someone have an interview guide, even if it's just a little sheet of paper, maybe it's just handwritten or it's not really printed out. Okay, maybe there's no grammar check there, for example. As long as there's something like a guide, okay, I would get that confidence, that get a confident feeling that okay, there's structure in the interview. Okay, although the context of interviews can vary considerably, okay, certain elements remain the same. Okay, structure, certain rules of etiquette, perhaps. Okay. In truth, you don't have to develop anything elaborate or time-consuming. It's an interview. You'll probably have so many interviews So it's not uh, needed maybe to, as they say, splitting hairs or sweating the small stuff. I mean, you don't have to do that for interviews. Have something structured, yes, the bare minimum, but you don't really need to have like a binder full of questions that comprises your interview guide, right? You probably don't need that. Unless you want to catch the interviewee off guard, you should share your interview guide. Okay, as we said that earlier, and be sure to take notes and write them legibly afterwards. Okay, taking down notes, it's not just for the purpose of gathering data, right? It is also a good signal to the interviewee that you're interested in them, because it gives the impression that you're really, really interested in what they're saying. Don't go through an interview, and even if you have the best memory out there, don't go in an interview not having a piece of paper and some pen with you. Okay, or if you're the type who likes to bring a laptop or a tablet or even your smartphones, okay, do that. But make sure that you don't want to to make sure that you don't want to come up with some with an impression that it is disrespectful for the interviewee, that you're not interested in whatever it is that they're saying. Okay. Now, interviewing is also about good listening. As we said earlier, it's about active listening. Now, when you're new to an organization, there are obvious benefits to listening. But listening isn't just for the new guy in the office. Even if you're quite experienced, it is still expected of you that you know how to listen. Now, effective managers spend the majority of their time listening. Unfortunately, our formal educational systems, they provide little training in listening. It's not like you've encountered a subject or a course in philosophy or in literature, in theology, that teaches you how to listen, right? Like there's a textbook that tells you how to listen in college. I don't think that's available. Well, there might be by this time, but you don't know. But at least back at least in recent memory, you probably don't have that type of course or that type of subject called listening. Now, active listening simply means encouraging and guiding the interviewee's responses through the effective use of verbal and nonverbal cues. Okay, nodding, some body language like arm crossing, facial expressions, they play a role in interviews. If you think about it, as we said earlier about interviews, I mean, it's formalistic in that sense, wherein your real intention is to gather data. But if you talk to other people, let's say you talk to friends, right? And you ask them questions because you want to know something about, like, how's their day, if you want to know how they've been doing throughout the week, if it's a weekend get together. It's like an interview, right? If you show through your body language that you're not interested, that you're bored, that you don't really care, how do you think your friend will feel that feel or with that, with what you've done, right? Of course, they will notice that you're not interested, that you didn't really care about them. As we said about interviews in the consulting context, it's not just about data gathering. Yes, in the context of this particular lecture, it is, but we also said that it is also about building the relationship. So the active listening part really helps in building that relationship. Okay, so it's important that we find a way to make sure that we signal to the interviewee that we're interested with them. If you're truly paying attention to the interview, then things will be natural, just like talking to a friend. If you feel that you're forcing them, meaning it's really difficult to, when I say it's forced, like you're trying to listen to them, but really they're boring. Or not really boring, but they're not really providing you with a lot of information that you really need. Well, maybe the interview should have ended a long time ago. Okay, so there. I mean, you also should know how to push and pull, right? You should know when to push the situation, try to extract as much information as you can from the interview, but you also know when to pull back, knowing that okay, this is enough. I don't think there's nothing more we can get from all this, right? And then be sensitive. The whole idea is being respectful also to the interviewees, even if they are not really returning the favor to you, right? So some people wrongly see interviewees as a source of information to be drained dry, some sort of a sponge. Squeeze them up, that's it. They have no use for you, discard them. Right? They're also human beings. They spent their time with you. They could have done something else during that time, but they chose to be with you, even if it's their boss that scheduled that interview with you, right? But, out of respect. Now, treat the interview as a chance to meet a new person and actively involve him or her in the problem-solving effort. Again, that relationship-building component of the interview. It's not just to extract information. It's really to build relationships. Okay? It's a two-way exchange that involves more than one-way information transfer. Sometimes in interviewing, while you would want to gather data from them, okay, it is also helpful that you give them something. You give them data even. You give them some information that might even be helpful for them. That's not a problem. Okay, so that's how we can do it as well. Okay, now when it comes to the actual interview, the beginning matters. Okay, it sets the tone for the rest of the time with the interviewee. Okay, so in a way it's true. Now first impressions matter. Okay, and learning to avoid sensitive taboo issues at the start. Right, and don't make it so uncomfortable with the interviewee right away. If you know that the topic can be a bit disconcerting for the interviewee, right? So, I mean, again, just like when you try to make a friend when meeting new for the very first time, you don't go right away with awkward stuff, right? At the start. It's not helpful for you. It's not going to be helpful for him or her, for your interviewee. But also, don't be naive in the sense that there will be people, okay, they have their own agenda as well. They may have even agenda specific to the interview. Okay? So just be aware that people, they have their own objectives also. They have their own intentions. They have their own tactics as well with you. Sometimes it's good to play along. No worries. Especially if it's harmless, really. But the important thing is that you shouldn't be naive. You shouldn't be like unnecessarily innocent of whatever it is that they also want. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not that you're trying to be skeptical or trying to be judgmental about their intentions. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, it's just that you also are aware that certain people maybe they don't like to be interviewed. Maybe they have some things in mind about you. Maybe they'd like to get to know you better, perhaps. I mean, that's fine. Okay, so but you avoid issues definitely that would lead to friction, because that would probably be counterproductive to your interview process. Okay. Now, so how do we go about with the interviews? Okay, so we believe that task completion must be balanced with process interaction. Task completion, this would mean extracting the data. Process interaction, this would mean about relationships. Okay, so that means you should try to get things done without stepping on people as you go. Okay, respecting them. Okay, so with interviewing, relationships matter. Think through your personal approach and consider expanding your capabilities as necessary. I mean, there are a lot of tools, there are a lot of books out there how to do or conduct effective interviews. They're all useful. I wouldn't really recommend one or two. I mean, I think all of them are okay. If you've collected all these books, you'll see that they overlap most of the time, so that's fine. I mean, you can whatever works for you, whatever floats your boat, as they say. I mean, use those books, use those references. And because interviews do take time, okay, think through your schedule and identify all the opportunities you have to obtain important information from people and how you should relate to those people. Okay. Yeah, interviews are structured. They're bounded by time, maybe 30 minutes, 1 hour. I mean, depends on your feel on the duration, depends on the interviewee, depends on the type of data you want to extract, okay? But remember, I mean, more than trying to maximize the time, it's really knowing that the time is there for them, right? It's really for them and not for you, if you think about it. So you should try to find more time to listen and less to speak. Okay? So even if it's 30 minutes, it's 1 hour, depending on your objectives, good. That's great. Structure everything around it. But at the end of it, because relationships matter, it's more about the listening than the speaking. It's not about the directing, okay? It's about trying to really accommodate and be receiving with the interview process. Now, structure doesn't end with the interview guide. Okay, we said that a while ago. And there are two additional opportunities for interview discipline. Okay, for us to put more structure. One is the pre-interview communication, and the other one is the post-interview follow-up. So pre-interview, you should send your interview guide to the interviewee ahead of time. Now, if you intend to ask sensitive questions, you probably don't have to say it right away in the pre-interview. You can probably say a general description of what you intend to gather. Sometimes that's enough, but out of courtesy, we really want to share even the exact questions themselves, right? But don't try to send it way ahead of time because there's that risk that the interviewee will be swamped with so much work that that interviewee guide would be lost in the midst of the daily work that he or she has to do. So send it well in advance, but not just like the day before or the same day itself, like just few minutes before, right? Give it a few days, maybe 3 days, 4 days. It's really your call. Depends on how busy the interviewee would be. Okay. And I mean, trust me, this is much better. People don't like surprises. So when you go through interviews, whatever interviews they may be, whether it's for consulting or for something else, it's good that you prep your interviewee by informing the interviewee of what you intend to ask, right? Now, post-interview also adds value to the interview process. It gives you a chance to confirm what you've said. So what can usually happen would be like you can do a summary, like minutes of the meeting. These are parts of it, okay? Similar, or if you intend to do some sort of a write-up, you share the write-up to the interviewee and get the buy-in or the confirmation of the interviewee. Okay, it's much better to have clarification, okay, earlier in the process because error can magnify over time. Okay, even a slight deviation, whether it's not intentional or not, it can blow things out of proportion. And don't forget to send your thank you notes, thank you letters, okay? Express that gratitude. That's also part of the post-interview. So don't just focus on the interview itself, okay? There's always the pre and there's also the post, okay? And there's a lot of effort that's required for both the pre and the post as well, okay? And on the matter of sensitivity, don't jump in right away with the sensitive topics. Don't jump in right away with taboo. Don't jump in right away with subject matter that would put the interviewee in an awkward situation. That is going to be counterproductive. Okay, you're not gonna extract much from it. Okay, it's usually safe to begin with a bigger picture. Sometimes it's you talking more. I mean, that's probably fine. You're trying to explain things at the start, but as the interview rolls out, as it passes on, as you spend more time with the interview, you will expect the interviewee to talk more than you. Okay, and all throughout, always make sure that you're sensitive with the interviewee. That you really want to make sure that the interviewee has a great time. Okay, in a way, you don't want to have a positive experience for the interviewee. And knowing that there are different strokes for different folks. So in some cases, there would be other things on what would make the interviewee have a positive feeling. There are other things that would make them a little bit easy. Okay, so that's also fine. Okay, but obviously it's important that you make the rapport first before you just jump in right away and yeah, I mean just trying to go ahead with the awkward stuff right away. Ease them in, build the rapport first, and then maybe if you feel that the time is right, then you can jump in with the more difficult questions. Now we've spent a lot of time talking about the interview. Now we go to the third part, okay, of for us in gathering data, and this is knowledge management. What is knowledge management? Well, we should tell you first what knowledge is. Okay, so it's not data, it's not information. It's processed. You can think of knowledge as some sort of processed information, right? But really, information knowledge is a mix of information, experience, and context in the value adding process. Okay, it's really more on the subject, right? And the thing there is that whatever information that gets processed and gets converted into knowledge, okay, that has to be communicated and shared with everybody else. Okay, so knowledge can be highly subjective because it is an infusion of insight as well, right? Of course, some people would argue that insight comes after knowledge. Okay, but the idea there that that's more than data, that's more than information. It's really a combination of all of these things that would help the subject, meaning you as a person, to make decisions, to capitalize on realizations or conclusions from these things. Okay. Now, there are two types of knowledge. We'll find that out eventually. There's tacit knowledge and there's explicit knowledge. So tacit is hidden. It's something that's not codified. Okay, and there's knowledge that is codified. Okay, that's really made explicit, documented, and we have to accept that fact that these two types of knowledge will always exist. Okay, there's no way that we can codify all the tacit knowledge. Okay, in a way, knowledge or the formation of knowledge is fluid. At every point as you are going through this lecture, you're actually gaining knowledge. Okay, I mean, even if you don't write that down separately in a notebook or in some digital device, okay, you're forming knowledge. Okay, and that's tacit knowledge as we go about with it right now. Okay, now knowledge management, okay, is the systematic process by which an organization maximizes the value of both tacit and explicit knowledge. Okay, there are many ways of doing that. Okay, some would force a certain portion of the tacit knowledge to be made explicit, but others would just accept the fact that there's really no way for you to codify tacit knowledge completely, so you just leave them as is. Okay, but sometimes it's still also beneficial to codify knowledge whenever it is possible. You'll probably see that as you go along, but that's not the intention of this lecture. But it's good for you to know that there's knowledge that is hidden from plain view, and there's knowledge that is properly documented or codified, as we say it. Okay. So many executives and academics focus their KM efforts on the codification strategy, converting tacit to explicit. Okay. And you have a lot of technology tools out there, platforms even. But even the best KM technologies can only capture a small portion of the true knowledge of the firm. Remember, true knowledge is both tacit and explicit. Okay. So a truly successful strategy must move beyond the technology. KM, or knowledge management, you'll realize that it's not just about the technology. Yes, technology helps. It's good. Okay. But it's more than that. Because you know that knowledge resides not in the codification of knowledge. Okay. Knowledge resides in the person himself or herself. So KM means, okay, I mean, it's taking advantage of what is known. Okay. Both tacit and explicit, in order to maximize that value. Of course, there are things that people know that's really useless for the company, right? That's still knowledge, technically speaking, but for the purposes of the company, for the purposes of the organization, that is not knowledge. Okay, that's useless for the organization. So you have to understand that there are certain things that are not really needed by the organization. So the job of knowledge management is to identify that as well, to really draw that line. What knowledge is useful for us, and what knowledge is useful for us. So don't reinvent the wheel. Whatever problem you're facing, chances are that someone somewhere has worked on something similar. That's the benefit of knowledge management, right? You don't want to go through that problem from scratch or from square one, as they say, right? So one way to do it is to have something like a know what database, like known issues database, like references. Okay. Back in the old days, pre-Google, companies, organizations would probably invest in real technologies to collect such massive repository of knowledge. But even Google is just like your garden variety knowledge management tool. I mean, everything that you probably need, you can just Google it, as they say. It has become a verb. Okay. But part of knowledge management is not just the know what, it's also the know who. Because we recognize that even if you have Google, there's also tacit knowledge that resides on the person himself or herself. So also knowing who's an expert in what is also useful information, right? And that is part of your knowledge management. And as databases, it should be easy for you to extract, manipulate, update, okay, archive your data according to some criteria. That's typical of any tool that's available for you. So, when it comes to implementing knowledge management, what are the things that you'd like to see happen? Well, one, developing a rapid response culture. Knowledge happens all the time, right? As I said, even as you go through this lecture, you get to pick up a lot of things. But yeah, it's really making sure that you gather all these things as soon as you can. Okay, and making sure that whatever knowledge was gained, you try to find a way to capture that. Okay, so that's the idea of rapid response. Next is acquiring external knowledge. Knowing that not all knowledge is available internally, so you do value external knowledge. Okay, that's also one thing there. And controlling the quality of your input. Garbage in, garbage out. A while ago, we said that not all knowledge can be useful for the firm. So we have to make sure that that's really the case. Now, what do we mean by rapid response culture? Okay, so this is really about culture. This is really about letting the organization know that the employees have responsibility to capture this knowledge as much as they can. Okay, so they have to be involved in the knowledge management process. Okay, doing documentation, codifying things, that's all part of it. And they have to do it quickly. They have to do it like eventually it's going to be like second nature to them. That's how it's supposed to be. Okay. So therefore, the culture has to support that type of behavior, and there could be things like incentive structures. Like, do you reward people? Do you reward your employees for supporting your KM efforts? Okay. Also, another way for us to promote this rapid response culture, if somebody asks for data from somebody else, how soon do you get that information? How soon do you get that data? That's also part of rapid response. Okay. Now, definitely, it is difficult to run an effective KM system without access to the uncodified or tacit knowledge of other people. Okay, by making sure that you have a rapid response culture that allows you to ask people, and then these people give you the responses right away. Okay, that would help. That would help augment your explicit knowledge system, right? So, so it's a combination of both the explicit and the tacit part that would ensure that you have a very strong and robust knowledge management system. Now, external knowledge, this means that okay, not everything can be learned from inside. Okay, you have to get something from outside as well. External knowledge matters as well. Okay. Now, naturally, whenever you start to do something, or if you have a question that you like to answer, you start with whatever that you have available inside. But at some point in time, you will reach that that wall that says that this is as far as you can go with internal. You have no other choice but to look external. That's what it is. Okay. So, okay, but when you go outside, of course, the recommendation is that you seek out true experts who come from multiple recommendations. Okay? So you have to be judicious also with where externally do you source your information. Okay, and staying engaged in their activities. Okay, uh, and then the reason why you want to stay engaged in their activities because it allows you to have access to future possible knowledge that's going to be generated by them. Okay, so that's also one way. So okay, one way is to capture the internal tacit knowledge. Another way is to make sure that you're in touch with the external experts. Okay. And then, of course, garbage in, garbage out, controlling your quality of your input. Okay, one of the biggest challenges in developing meaningful KM codification systems is ensuring the accurate and timely data availability. Data availability. Make sure that those without first-hand knowledge of the subject matter can interpret the inputs to your KM system. So this has something to do also with design. No? If you create a system that comes up with so many instructions, that comes up with so much interpretation, then probably that's a poor system. That's a poorly designed system. So make sure that even those who may not be experts in that field, when they go over that KM system, they know how to handle that system. Also, make sure that any document can be retrieved via the relevant keywords or other search methodology. Nowadays, there's a lot of algorithms, okay, techniques for us to be able to do unstructured searches. Okay, I mean, like I said, Google is a very powerful tool, but that would be your garden variety knowledge management system, right? And of course, without proper incentives and dedicated resources, KM systems can also become garbage. It's like dumping things there, but if they're not really useful, then it doesn't make sense. It's a useless KM system. It will just rot out. Nobody's going to use your KM system because they haven't really gotten the benefit out of it. Okay. Okay. When establishing your KM culture, the entire organization must participate. Okay. It starts from the top even. It starts from the fact that your executives, your leaders have to support all knowledge management initiatives, right? If you think about it, in schools where they have learning management systems like Canvas, for example, that is actually a form of a knowledge management system. Okay, eventually all the things that you've encountered in your classes, okay, they'll be stored in that knowledge, that learning management system. Okay, and the data can be easily retrieved. You can actually get resources there conveniently, and those courses can be referred to again sometime in the future, so they can be even be reused. Okay. So in conclusion, okay, that's data gathering for you. Okay. In many organizations, too much energy is spent gathering the wrong data, and too many decisions are made without adequate data support. So you can see the value of making sure that we have the right data with us. And for that, as they say, happy hunting, happy gathering the data. And with that, that's where we end our lecture, gathering the data. If you have questions about this particular lecture, feel free to email me or drop me a note at your most convenient time. For that, thank you very much and see you guys around.